Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, but people west of the Mississippi had to wait for the election result. No planes, trains, or automobiles, or telegraph or telephone. Enter the Pony Express. The first mission of the brand new mail service was to deliver news of Lincoln's election from the middle of the country to the West Coast. From that point on, the Pony Express became the stuff of lore and legend, lots of fact and fiction about the Pony Express, but our guest sets the record straight in his book, West Like Lightning, The Brief Legendary Ride of the Pony Express. That's Jim DeFelice. When I spoke to him earlier this year, he told me this book was more than history. It was fun.
To do that, I went back across the old trail, much of which is accessible either by car or walking. There's a few places where you might have to sneak through some barbed wire, but we won't talk about those. And if you have pictures, Don, I'm sure that wasn't me.
Right. Well, it wasn't a straight line from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, was it?
No, absolutely not. And a lot of the reason had to do with the fact that the guys that owned the Pony Express and started it, built it kind of on the backbone of their other enterprises, including stagecoach lines and things. They're also quite the entrepreneurs. The reason that the Pony Express starts in St. Joe, Missouri, of all places, has to do with the deal that they managed to wrangle, I guess would be a polite way of putting it, out of the city.
Out of the city, and so it didn't start in St. Louis because it didn't have to.
No, you would think it would start at St. Louis. It might make sense, and then you look at the distance and time, and okay, you could possibly accept that. But St. Joe is on the wrong side of the river if you're going to race there, because what would happen is the rider would get the mail, and as a 19, 20-year-old, 21-year-old kid, and he would gallop out of the hotel or wherever where they're starting from that day and race down the road. And I mean, really, very impressive. All the ladies, of course, be throwing him flowers and maybe the equivalent in those days of giving him their cell phone number. He would race down to the river, and then he'd have to wait for the ferry across. So what was going on? Well, as it turns out, Alexander Majors and his partners, the men who own the Pony Express, they have nothing. I should say sports teams trying to move stadiums around have nothing on these guys. These guys drove the hardest bargain up and down the river, and St. Joe gave them a great deal. They
were in it to make money. That's what the whole thing was about. It wasn't to serve what population was west of the Mississippi or Missouri.
No, well, they wanted to create an empire. Basically, if you had anything to be delivered, whether it was information like the mail or people or military supplies or a stove, they wanted to be the ones that were doing it. And the Pony Express was part of that scheme.
And we should point out that this started in 1860, and the first piece of mail or information that was delivered westward was the election of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, the Lincoln election is actually a key message, and that happens obviously in the fall. And it's so important that they put on extra riders. They used the telegraph, which they were using actually all throughout the existence of the Pony Express and the railroads to help speed it off. And it's less than 10 days that they get the message to California. The normal time for travel for mail was 10 days, but this was a special run, and it's much shorter. You think 4 years before the election with Buchanan, it had taken months. So, I mean, it was just a radical change.
Were these riders going at full speed? I mean, I know that every few miles they would change horses and sometimes riders, but when they were riding, were they really riding?
Well, they're really riding in town and out of town because, as I said, they're 19, 20-year-old young men. And, if there's any sort of audience around of young ladies, they're going to impress them. But the truth is that they're averaging roughly 8 miles an hour. So for most of their relay, say, they'd be riding it. Say it's faster than a walk, maybe a half gallop, quarter gallop, depending exactly where you are. You can think of it almost as a relay race. They would start from what they called a home station. It'd be a relatively, depending on where you were, it was a relatively well-established either small hotel or, in some cases, a stable or a farm. They would ride for about 10 miles. There'd be a kid, generally a young man about 8 or 9 or 10, standing out in all sorts of weather holding the horse. The rider would come up. He'd jump off the horse he was riding, grab a mochila or a mochila, depending on who's pronouncing it. But it's a special kind of mailbag. Throw it on the saddle of the new horse and ride off for another 10 miles. He would do that for anywhere from 80 to 100 miles, roughly, depending on where we're at. The entire route was about 1,800 miles from St. Joe, Missouri, to Sacramento, and there was also a regular run down from Sacramento down to San Francisco via steamer.
My impression from the book is that all of these young men were kind of built like jockeys. They were small, as I recall. It's been a couple of weeks since I finished the book, but I guess you could compare them in some ways to jockeys. You want them small so they could carry more mail, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there are a couple of exceptions that we know of. It's a little bit, the records of the Pony Express were either burned or lost or otherwise misplaced due to some of the reasons that the Pony Express ends in the first place. But we think, so because of the loss of the records, it's hard to definitively know who was a rider. But from what we can tell, they're fairly skinny young men, and what they all have in common is not only are they great riders and in general from the area, so they know all the shortcuts, but they're also really good with horses. You have there's an instance, for instance, where we know one young man, Nick Wilson, it's also called the White Indian, who gets his job as a rider out in Utah at, I believe it was 16, because the superintendent of the line saw him taming wild horses, and he just had a way with horses, and a lot of these young men did.
They were really dedicated. The ones you write about, if they got to a relay station and the Indians had burned it down or no one was there, they'd continue on and just extend their tour.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredible. Obviously in a case such as you mentioned, where it's extraordinary, you can say, okay, well, what else would he have done? I mean, he wasn't going to hang around there and, get shot at or what have you. But again and again, you find these stories about them just continuing on and riding for another, they're riding 10, 12 hours a day through all sorts of weather, day and night, and, and still going. And the thing that interested me when I first started, I thought that the riders would brag about how fast they went. No, what they bragged about was how far they went. Oh no, I went 200 miles. I think it looks to me like the longest that any rider went, and there's a couple of men who may have done this, was about 350, 360 miles. Think about that. That's a lot of time in the saddle.
Yeah. You talk about the difficulty in researching something like this, and yet you were able to come up with quite a bit of information, even though The Pony Express only lasted for 18 months or so, and there were few records that survived that. Where did you get this stuff?
Well, first of all, there are a few records that you can look up. There happens to have been a census right around the time that the Pony Express was had to be suspended because of a war with the Pyramid Lake Indians, and so you had a number of riders who just happened to be in this hotel where the census taker went, and there's kind of the cool little stuff like that, but. Every newspaper of the day at the time would have on its front page, this just in from the Pony Express. So you have a lot of data there. But for me, the most enjoyable part of the research was going to the many, many, many small museums and historical societies along the way. And I have to tell you, Don, the people that I met there, they were so incredibly helpful. And it was just a joy just to talk to them. And frankly, I could have stayed all day in just about every place I went.
And a lot of these riders lived into the 20th century, too. And I guess their stories were written by somebody, or maybe they told stories that were passed down from generation to generation.
Absolutely. And, of course, the problem, what happens is that Pony Express, although it only lasts for 18 months, becomes so famous after it's, towards the turn of the century, it becomes has a resurgence in fame, that we get a lot of stories that may or may not be true. Like the most famous, the greatest Pony Express rider of all time would be Buffalo Bill. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of problem in that, though, as you go and you research about the greatest Pony Express rider of all time, who, by the way, was a genuine hero and did get a Medal of Honor and incredible man and did a lot, really, for keeping the Pony Express alive. But when you go and you check that stuff, truth is he didn't actually ride for the Pony Express. But what are we going to say?
But he did incorporate it into his very, very popular shows that were played not only in this country but in other parts of the world, too. And people just loved the Pony Express stuff.
Absolutely. And that was, we were talking about the Wild West shows, which, at the time were revolutionary. It's like and they were huge events. It's like the Super Bowl coming to your town. They went to New York City. They went to London, Boston, all the places. But they also went to, small towns in the Midwest, in the West, and because the shows would often start and end, and sometimes both, with a vignette of the Pony Express. And it's largely because of that we have so many stories and we remember the service today.
Yeah, it certainly is an iconic chapter in the country's history. Jim, what would a typical ride be like? I mean, we know the movies and we've seen some of the books and some of the illustrated books, and every time these guys turn around, they're being chased by Indians. That wasn't really the case, was it?
No, that wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, as far as we can tell, that may have been the case on exactly one ride, one segment. Although there was, as I had said earlier, there was a war that interrupted the Pony Express. To be honest, for the most part, while it would be very exciting at points when the Pony Express started, for instance, that day there were bands and marches and parades and a lot of young women, as I had said earlier. But for the most part, you're talking about, a very grueling work day of 10, 12 hours in the saddle. And, you're riding, there are some reports of the riders just about falling asleep in the saddle, and then the horse taking them onto the next station, and so on. They would do that. There were 2 runs. They would typically have 2 runs of the Pony Express a week, and the riders, for the most part, would be riding kind of in both directions. So they would start, say, in St. Joe, and then ride about 80 miles there. And drop off their mailbag, and then wait for the next one to come in, and then they would do it again. Mm-hmm. And depending on where you were, those 2 runs might be back to back. At the end of the day, you were pretty much, or at the end of your ride, you were pretty much exhausted. If you were lucky, you could sleep in the corner of the stable. When the straw was pretty warm. If you weren't that lucky, then maybe you were in an attic somewhere. So it was pretty hard. On the other hand, the riders were being paid very well, about $100, actually exactly $100 a month.
That was a lot of money in the day, wasn't it?
That was when money was real money.
Yeah.
You know that, especially in Kansas, in Utah, Nevada, it was very good. In California, there's because they're pulling that shiny stuff out of the ground, the values were a little bit off, but that's still considered pretty good money for somebody that's 19, 20 years old.
Weather, certainly a factor.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things to me, when I was researching it, was to see how steep a lot of the trails in the Sierra Nevada were, and how narrow they were. I was on one trail, and I think I have a photo of it in West Like Lightning in the book, where basically I'm not a really wide person, but I could not get there's no way I could have extended my arms out, and yet these men would ride through them gallop through as fast as they could.
When there wasn't snow on the ground, frequently there was snow right up to the horse's nose,
or over it, and they would ride through the snow. There was a couple of instances that we know of in looking at the records where they obviously took a day, or several hours to try to gather themselves at in shelter, but remarkably, the runs, we know how long the runs were. There was only one run where the mail got lost, and that mail mysteriously turns up somewhere else, or turns up actually where it was supposed to go afterwards. So every piece of mail that was supposed to be delivered was delivered. And we know from the records, because remember they're stamped, they're being stamped and noted, that most of the time they did do it in 10 days.
What did it cost to send a letter to California from, say, St. Louis?
Well, it cost $5. Of course, $5 then is a little different than $5 now. I mean, I think I have some of the estimates in the book would put it over $150 in equivalent today. Now, they did lower the price, and I think it gets all the way down to 50 cents at one point.
About where it is now.
Yeah, about where it is now. Actually, it's less than it is now, right?
Yeah.
And listen, I mean, I'd like to say that my mailman has delivered every piece of my mail. I'm not sure I could swear on that on a stack of Bibles.
Was most of the mail personal letters, or was it official business kind of stuff?
Yeah, most of the mail was actually official business. There was a little bit more mail coming west to east. The price did keep a lot of people from mailing. You find the personal letters, a lot of them, and I include one actually in the book from a writer actually. The personal letters are, when are you coming? When are you coming home there? And a lot of them obviously have been lost or kept by the families. The other thing that you had a lot of were letters of news. As the news organizations every newspaper, they were using it like the wire services or the internet, services are used today. And you would find stories from the Pony Express on the front pages, not just of the papers in Missouri or Kansas or California, but also the New York Times, the smaller papers in Washington, Boston. It's very popular.
You mentioned one thing that most of us don't think of when we think of the Pony Express. We think of the mail going west, but it was coming the other way as well.
Oh, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, it was it was very important to the people in the East, especially the politicians and bankers who wanted that gold that they were digging out.
Yeah.
But to the people in the West, it was so important that at one point during the Pyramid Lake Indian War, the Pony Express substations are burned down. A lot of them, because it was nothing against the Pony Express, but those were the only buildings there, and some of them were destroyed. And the people we'll call it the Sacramento area, it was a greater area there, got together, raised money, and volunteered to help rebuild those stations to get the service going. That's how important it was to them.
If I was in New York, let's say, and wanted to send a letter to Sacramento, How would I get it to St. Joe?
Well, what you could do is you could walk right down to the biggest, shiniest, the newest building in the city down on Wall Street, actually around the corner of Wall Street, and you could hand it if you wanted to the Pony Express clerk. You might even be able to grab one of the owners there, or you could be a little less fancy and use the postal service. And the letter would go by train primarily out to St. Joe, and it would take roughly 3 days, generally 3 days. From St. Joe, it would, and of course you had put a special stamp on it, hopefully. Because I don't know if in those days, if they delivered, if you didn't stamp it. I know they don't now. It would then go to the Pony office in St. Joe, in, again, the fanciest building, at least in that part of the country, and where they had their office. And in 10 days, it would, and maybe depending on the weather or whatever, maybe 11 days or 10 and a half, it would it would come into Sacramento in right by the river in a building that's kind of been recreated, but is essentially still there. And from there, as it came in, if your letter was going to San Francisco, it would be put into a special bag, and a young man would grab the bag and run over to the waiting steamer, and the steamer would take it downriver to Sacramento and over to the bank, probably to the bank if you're from New York. That's probably where it's going.
So it'd take maybe close to 2 weeks to get a letter from New York City to San Francisco.
Absolutely, and that compares to before that it would take 6 months or so. And the incredible thing is that the amount of time, what it does is it shrinks your idea of distance, and it helps unify the country. When one of the things you notice is if you drive cross country, and you start thinking of distance as time. Well, so did the people in 1860, and the idea of the country not being something that takes months to cross, but now just takes 10 days, shrinks. Not only does it shrink your idea of distance and the country, but it also starts to help unify the country and bring it closer and closer together.
How would you describe the Pony Express's importance in the development of this this country?
I think it's important, partly, in terms of the idea of the country and helping to unify it. And obviously, information is always important, and you have the material aspects of the gold and the money. It's very critical, as I say in the book. It was critical to the Northerners to keep California in the Union and to keep the idea of communication there. But the Pony Express was also integrating the new technologies of the time, the telegraph and the railroad. People think that those killed the Pony Express, when the reality is that they were actually baked into the formula from the beginning. And so the role at the time is to help integrate the country and to kind of compress it and unify it at a time when you have a lot of, obviously, violent disagreement. Now, what happens afterwards, when, as we approach the turn of the century and we have the Wild West show, the Pony Express becomes kind of the embodiment of a lot of our legends, a lot of the stories that we tell about the Old West. And so it becomes kind of a capsule to tell us what's important, what we think is important about being American, about being individuals against the environment, about heroism, and just kind of physical endurance. And it takes all of those stories and it puts them in kind of an entertaining format. But as we tell them and as we think about them, what we're really doing is reinforcing what we think is important about America.
So why did it only last 18 months?
Well, it only lasted 18 months for a couple of reasons. The men who started it, William Russell especially, he's kind of the idea guy and the finance, the kind of I'm going to get the money guy. The others are more hands-on and in the office business thing. He knew that it was going to be a short-term thing. His goals, he had two real goals. One was to get a lot of publicity out of it, make it something that was really exciting and would excite people, and people would know when they would know the Pony Express, and therefore they'd know the companies that owned it, and that worked. But the other thing he wanted was $1 million contract from the government to keep that empire he was trying to build alive. And the plan was, although it's not written down, it was probably once we get that contract, and we'll keep that, we'll live up to the contract, but then by that point we'll just we'll phase it out, and we'll have our empire of everything from mail delivery to stagecoaches to stores to banks, which they had all of those things. But what happens, you have the Civil War, so obviously that's disruptive. The technology,
somewhat, I would think.
somewhat, right? And you also have the technology comes along a little bit faster, I think, than even Russell would have thought. But mostly, there's a huge financial scandal, which I get into in the book, and has to do with making promises you can't keep.
Author Jim DeFelice, author of West Like Lightning, The Brief Legendary Ride of the Pony Express. Our conversation took place in July.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.